Hello, good to see you.
Thank you.
Yeah. So as we're starting off, we're just kind of getting a pulse on what the specific area that you wanted to learn more about, either in diversity, equity, inclusion, one of them, or anything specific. No? Okay. All right. So just so you guys know, a number of people in the community couldn't attend, so they asked me to record this. Are you guys okay with me recording this? Everybody okay? Okay. All right. So I don't think there's anything too sensitive that we're going to be talking about. So just kind of for ease of communication, so if you have a question, this is a conversation, okay? So it's not me talking the whole entire time. You can easily use the feature in Zoom to react, to raise your hand, or you can do it just stick your hand up and just kind of wave, right? And say, I have a question, or if you really like something, you can do a thumbs up. If you're not too sure, you know, just do a little hand signal. For those of you with a camera on, great, I can see your face, I can see that, and I can engage with you in that way. If you don't have a camera on, you can easily use any of the buttons, annotate buttons to kind of get involved and ask different questions, okay? All right, so let's go ahead and get started. Looks like there's a few more people joining here. Hi, Nan. Hi, Juan. Okay, so a couple of starting points for basic rules of the conversation. One of the things that we want to stay focused on is a solution orientation. In the current conversation, there's a lot of blame, excuses, denial, which means you're in bed. And when we're having those conversations, it's hard to get around to actually looking at solutions for how do we get ahead? How do we move forward as a community, right? So one of the basic rules of engagement in our conversations here, if I would like to ask you to be okay with, is we have conversations around ownership, accountability, responsibility. So at all times, we're going to stay above the line and not get to blaming people and so forth, and then as well as focusing on topic. Is that okay with everybody with this rule? Feel free to just kind of raise your hand, say yes, thumbs up. Okay, great. All right, so let's talk about diversity, the DEI movement, okay? Now, one of the first things I want to mention in this DEI movement is that the conventional approach to DEI is fairly challenging. Most companies are doing a very horrible job at it. So people have a pretty bad taste on exactly what this DEI thing is. And it's being used sometimes in unfair ways to different populations. So for example, how many of you have required DEI trainings at this point in your companies? Everybody has to take it once a year type of thing, right? I see Sarah raising your hand. So one of the fascinating aspects is when we look at DEI, forced training doesn't necessarily get to the point, right? So when we look at diversity, any kind of generic training has no understanding of the population you're talking to. So it violates the principle of diversity. Diversity is looking at every single person's individual thoughts and how valuable that thought can be, and how do we move forward based on understanding of their diversity of thoughts and from where they come from in their background. So generic training doesn't really work. Okay. The other side is forced training. Whenever companies force you to learn something, not very effective because it violates inclusion. You would never ask if you wanted to participate in training, right? So when people force you to learn, even though sometimes things that may be fun, right? Why are you forcing me to learn? I have no time, or my work plate is so full, right? You're adding additional stresses that not necessary, okay? And then the last part of this forced regular training is the same training to everybody. It violates the principle of equity. And we're going to talk about each one of these in a lot more detail and what they are from an academic perspective, as well as how it goes into the practice perspective. And then the final challenge in the conventional approach to DEI is the quota game. I did a podcast on this not too long ago with some British authors. I'm not too sure if you saw that, but I can easily send a link to you. It's called the podcast called The Fix. But basically on the quota game, it's a lot of companies saying, okay, we don't have enough minorities at this level, this level, this level. Let's go hire some, right? Everybody has some great notions of hiring it, but what's underneath the surface is never talked about. So for example, a lot of companies have a chief diversity officer position, so they can pad the numbers on the minority side at the executive level, right? Now, the interesting part, when you look deeper at this, certain companies, even in Central Ohio here, have put a budget of, let's say, $200,000 or a little over $200,000 for one particular company here, right on the north side of Columbus here. And what they did is they said, okay, here's a position. You get a budget of $100,000. Okay. Imagine what that feels like, right? You're at a C-level position, which counts as a number game. You're given a budget of $100,000. You're put into a bucket where you have no resources, no ability to really do anything. And many companies are doing that just to pad the numbers on the quota side. And even more importantly, on the quota side, if people of minority get hired, now they're getting asked questions. You can hire for your color, your race, or whatever, and people are not, the culture of inclusion and culture of working together is a huge challenge in many companies, right? So, and within the school districts, it's rather interesting. We've done a lot of studies on different school districts and how they're handling it. And many of them are hiring a chief diversity officer or director of diversity, right? And we looked at one of our neighboring districts here. It's quite interesting. They hired an individual for 2 years. After 2 years, when we ask about what did you achieve, what did you accomplish in those 2 years of work, the only achievement was magnets of a diversity hotline on all the buildings. And then when we asked how many phone calls did you get on the diversity hotline, 0, which obviously points to some issues. And the approach in the quota game basically lets people stop thinking about the systemic issues. Okay, so one of the key things we want to talk about here is that the DEI movement is here to address systemic racism. Now, what exactly is a system, right? Systems are not really typically taught in most of the education from undergrad, from K-12 all the way to undergraduate, and even in master programs not taught. I learned about systems thinking in my first doctorate program, right? And it's a very complex idea. So what is a system? Let's take a look at the diagram over here, okay? So this is an individual learning system, how you learn, right? We start with individual perceptions at the very top. How do you perceive reality? How are you seeing this presentation, right? There's certain colors jump out at you as good or bad or whatever emotional connotation may be. What are your thought processes, right? There's many people that allow their emotions get in the way. If I don't like you, I'm gonna find all the reasons why I don't like you. Or if I don't like you, we'll find all the reasons I like you, right? People have different thought processes. We look at that aspect from an educational perspective. And then we find the new information in order to move people ahead so that whatever the new information is delivered to you in a way that you can understand it, absorb it, and incorporate it into your life, okay? So the reason why I put that in yellow is in most situations, when we looked at the traditional training method in most companies, it's all they do is push new information at you. Sometimes the information is great, but what about the application? How do we apply any of this? If we don't apply it, our retention is going to be relatively really, really low, okay? So application of that new information is going to be part of the key to learning and retaining that information. And then the next part is the metrics and feedbacks, right? Creating the metrics feedback so that you get a good understanding of, hey, this helped me better my presentation skill. This helped me build a better relationship with my children, right? Whatever the metric is, there has to be some type of metric to create that emotional bond to that new piece of information. Therefore, your brain will remember it, okay? That's how new knowledge gets created, is this full system that enables a human brain to learn at the individual level. That is a system, okay? In most parts of our education, there's many parts that are missing. Most of you work in certain workplaces, and the challenge is they're always pushing new information, right? What about the rest of this? When we talk about inclusion, as Sarah indicated, inclusion is a huge aspect. How do you perceive reality? What is your thought processes? Before we engage in any kind of education, especially as adults, these two parts in the beginning has to be there to get a good understanding of where are you? What do you need to learn so that we can build the right type of information on top of your existing knowledge, right? Now, taking this part, this is at the individual level. Systemic racism is a number of different systems on top of this, okay? So systems, one thing about systems are not people, okay? A system is something that is set by somebody at some point. Think of it as a football game, for example, okay? Football game is a system with a lot of rules and regulations on how to play the game. Very finite, very detailed, right? When it comes to life is somewhat of a game, kind of play the game of life. Anybody follow the work of Simon Sinek, right? He talks about the infinite game and the finite game, right? a lot of what we look at in how do we shift systemic racism or system has to do with your performance management system, for example, right? You all go through an annual review process, right? Is that a system? In most companies, it's not. Managers don't like dealing with it. Employees don't like dealing with it. HR don't like dealing with it, but yet they repeat the process over and over again every single year. Does it really help you learn? Does it really help you grow? Right? Hiring systems, another example. Most people use an outdated hiring process, which gets us to this point of all the discrimination. But when it comes to discrimination, if you look at the human brain, it comes back to how are we shifting the way we see reality? How are we shifting the way we see human beings as fellow human beings, as opposed to, well, you're in this bucket, therefore I can't hire you just because you're in this bucket. Okay, how is that fair? How is that equitable? All right, so those are just some examples of systems. Okay, when it comes to learning in our education and learning happens in a communal system. We do not learn in isolated systems, right? If you read a great book and don't do anything with it, that's an isolated system. What happens after that book? You'll most likely forget it. Even though it might be a great book, entertainment value is there, but if you don't apply it, it's gone. This is where you can engage in your significant other, you can engage your peers and say, oh, I learned this in this book, hold me accountable next week for applying this, right? Making learning into a communal system makes it a lot more fun and also creates that accountability structure so that you can move through an entire system of learning that betters your life and your skills, okay? So any questions on systems from that perspective? Oh, good. Okay. Great. All right. So next, we're going to look at the DEI. Okay. This is a model that we developed to help get a good understanding of what DEI really is. There's 5 dimensions here, and this is like a simplified version. There's many, many variables into DEI. Okay. The first part of DEI is the diversity piece. Right. Diversity comes initially from our brain. How do we come to perceive reality? When we look at diversity, we'll have our core values. What are your core values? What do you believe in? What gets you excited? What gets you angry? You understand the core value side. And then we also have our beliefs. Beliefs about people, beliefs about religion, beliefs about a color, a car, a type of car, whatever that is, those beliefs. And then, of course, your identity. Who am I? Am I a strong, powerful individual? Am I here to do what? Right? Those 3 pieces form the glasses that we use to see reality. That's the perception, okay? So diversity starts off with the perception of reality as an individual. Now, as we move outside of that, the lighter green here is characteristics that you can't change, right? So your age, for example, you're born with it, it continues to get old, although none of us like getting old sometimes, but it's gonna happen, we can't change that. And then when we look at other things like gender, right? Genders these days with technology can be somewhat changed, okay? So it's in both. At that darker green, these are things at the individual level that you drive, you have control over, you're empowered to do something. So new ideas, any one of you come up with brilliant ideas. And I believe in our community, we have a lot of great ideas with the amount of diversity, amount of people and experiences that we all see, okay? So that's the idea side of it. That's the individual piece that we can all move forward and use to better our community. You know, education is another piece. How do we go about creating education? Now, part of education is connected to the not changeable part, because what's not changeable is what do we come from within our parental structure, right? Our family, what are their views of education? Some of those things are programmed into us from the family dynamics, from your grandparents sometimes even, right? So education has some play between what is fixed and what is not fixed. And every single one of us can easily enhance our education. We have a free library system. We have so many different tools to better our education. Okay. And then moving into the green, the blue part, which is the team level for the DEI space, this is where the equity and the inclusion starts happening. Okay. So when you have an idea at the individual level, how does that get moved to the team level to start building an innovation, right? Innovation is a shared concept. It's multiple ideas building on top of each other with some practical value. So it moves into the team space, okay? On the other side of the team space, there's a lot of relationships here, right? What's my relationship with my boss, with my friends, with my colleagues, with my kids, right? All those are relational aspects to keep in mind of how do we make sure that the equity and inclusion happens on a regular basis. when you make a decision that involves your kiddos, your family members, even your team, do you include them on a regular basis? Do you solicit input before changes are made, which is one of the bigger challenges here, right? And then we move out to the red side, which is the organizational level. And this is where an entire district and the complexity of the district starts to have a lot of manifestations of the challenges in DEI. If we don't take care of the internal aspects of it, the stuff out here, it's just going to be really, really ugly, as we've seen. Okay, so things like organizational culture. What's the culture of Dublin? What's the culture of any school district, and how are we moving forward? Right. So that's some of the aspects that we're always going to be challenging to look at. When we look at systems, right? How do we promote people based on a fair and equitable way that includes their involvement, that includes their development, right? Individually, we all can all learn. The team, we can all learn to work together better from an inclusive perspective. At the organizational level, systems like learning systems has to be equitable, so in such a way that people can learn in a fair and reasonable way that it matches what they need. Right. So that's a very quick way of kind of giving you an overview of the model to some extent. Any questions on this before I move forward to get more detailed into each one of the equity or diversity, equity, inclusion part? No? Okay. Okay, so let's talk about diversity. Now, this is a fascinating topic because it's so emotionally charged these days, partially because it's being used as a weapon to hurt others, exclude others, and so forth. When we look at diversity, the academic definition is over here in the blue, right? The similarities and differences are visible and invisible, okay? The challenge is when most people look at diversity, they only look at the visible part, right? The demographic shell, okay? We all have a shell around us, our ethnicity, our skin color, our education basis, whatever that is. And organizations are using it in a horrible way that they only look at the visible part with the quota game that we talked about earlier. Okay. When we look at diversity, the key part about diversity is the diversity of thought, of the individual thought that matters, right? So, for example, the golden rule of respect. How many of you believe in the golden rule of respect? Raise your hand. Leslie, Sarah, everybody? Okay, great. Now, in the golden rule of respect, the rule is do unto others as I would like to be done unto me, right? How many people are like you? Exactly like you. Not very many, right? You're all unique, beautiful individuals. That's how we're created. Every single one of us has different features, different thoughts, but yet the golden rule of respect often gets us to think, hey, if I'm the center of the universe, everybody's like me, so I treat others like I want to be treated. But in reality, if we reflect and honor diversity of thought, our first task is to look at how do they want to be treated? How do they think? How are they perceiving the situation? How am I perceiving you? And some of us like to be hugged. Other people don't want to be touched, right? A handshake is perfectly fine. And now with the pandemic, people are more or less, oh, do I give you fist pump? Do I touch your things? Or do I do an elbow pump, right? Everybody's confused on how do you give an initial gesture. But then that's where the rule of respect has to be reformulated in your brain to say, it's not about what I want. It's about honoring and understanding what the other people want. That's the key here from a respect perspective. I did a whole podcast on this, and if you're on any of the podcasts, just look for Break the Box. And I did a whole podcast on this, looking at respect, what happened to respect in the olden days of how it was formed in an environment where none of us moved around. We drove around in horses and buggies and so forth in those little villages that we had. So it's easy to use that rule back then, right? Now that we have this globalization concept and so many people's moved around, it can't be used anymore. Okay, so look at the aspect of the golden rule. The second part about diversity of thought, judgment. Okay? There's so many people in this space that are coming out with very, very harsh judgments on other people when they look at one single dimension of light. If I see you do one thing, therefore you're automatically this whole ball of mess. Okay. If we're honoring diversity, look at the individual as the person and honor that based on the individual relationship you have with that person, so that diversity is looked at from an honor perspective and understanding where that person comes from. So if I may do something wrong, have a conversation with me, please, right? Engage in a conversation. You can seek understanding. That's the key part of what diversity comes in, so that every voice matters, not a few. And in this political arena, the system is set up for people to fight. Okay, so if we start peeling back what diversity really is, it's not about some external shells. It's about how each individual enhances our own ability to see what the others need and move forward as a human species, as one fellow human being to another. Because at the end of the day, we're all members of our community. It's our neighbors. Why get jumped to judgment so that you can be right? At the end of the day, you start getting into a fight. Okay, in a fight, nobody really wins. Right. All right. Any questions on this? No? Okay, great. Now, moving forward, what do we do with all that, right? Here's something that's very simple and practical, okay? When you look at the right here, that's your left. So when you look at the iceberg model here, okay, at the surface, we see behaviors, right? We all know underneath the iceberg is much, much bigger and complex. So you have thought processes. Thought processes are built upon your knowledge base and your skill base, right? Underneath that, you have your perceptions of reality, which is your values, beliefs, and identity, okay? A very simple activity to engage with within your family, within your home, within your team, however you want to do that. What are your top 5 values? Have you ever written that down? Getting a good understanding of who you are as a human being, of what you value, and let that guide you moving forward, right? If we had time, we would sit down and say, okay, all of you, write down your top 5 values, okay? And then when you go home, when you leave this workshop, go ask your spouse, go ask somebody that's close to you, hey, you've known me for so many years. What do you think my top values are, right? See if what you've written down matches what they say. That will be a very empowering conversation, okay? I learned this kind of the very interesting way. Many years back, I was doing a workshop. And after the workshop, these 2 people came up to me and said, you know, we've never talked about values. This is great. We're getting married next week. And I looked at that as, interesting. Why is that? Why is that not an active conversation, right? I wasn't married at that time, so I decided to do an experiment on myself. The next person I was looked at as a potential dating scenario, I asked her right in the beginning of a dating situation, right? Hey, what are your values, right? We share commonalities in playing volleyball. Great, what are your values? And I got an immediate kickback saying, we don't talk about that till much later. We don't discuss that up in the early dating relationship piece. That's not discussed, right? So I've had a very interesting conversation with people throughout the number of years that I started researching in this area, to the point that I've gotten fairly interesting responses from various people about what are your values. And the sad part is all over the world, it takes people 10, 20 minutes to figure out what their core values are. How do we go about making decisions without really knowing the system of how we see life, of how we should make decisions, right? So taking this very simple process here, write down your top 5 values, get other people to guess what it is, and play a game with it. If you're married, I bet you anything, it'll help you resolve some conflicts that have not yet happened. Or if you're dating, or with your kid, even with your kids, right? Understanding their value set will eliminate future challenges because they're going to make decisions based on their values. And if we don't know the values up front, then we can easily say, oh, we're the parent, you're wrong. And that's a conflict that happens with many teenagers. Okay. So getting a better understanding of that, taking time to reflect, right? Take one value every single week. How am I reflecting that top value that I hold so dear? How do I become more consistent? So with the congruence aspect, it gives you inner peace. This is something that every single human being wants. We want to know that what we aspire to, we're achieving it, we're working towards it, right? And not never letting anybody, any pressures cave you into something that you don't want. Okay, so that's the value side, right? Now I've kind of laid this out in a process and a system. So the process is linear, it stops here. Okay, in a system of values, we look at what are your values, that's your tacit knowledge, what you personally know, and we can put a lot of different things in here, right? Your favorite game, your favorite color, your favorite activities, or what you're passionate about. And then we set a priorities list. Number 1, top value. Number 2, values all have priorities in your brain, right? We have that. Do that within your family. Do that within your classrooms. Do that within your company. Get a truly shared set of values together. And then the last part, hey, let's apply it. Let's figure out how do we make these values come true in everyday decisions, right? At the end of the day, we use it to build stronger relationships. Okay? So that's the core of what diversity starts at. Any questions? Good. Okay. So how many of you are going to go try the activity? Write down your values and ask a significant other or somebody to see if they can guess it. It's really fun. Trust me. Okay. Now let's talk about equity. Okay. So I have a very common
Ted,
picture. Yes, Sarah.
You actually have a question in the chat. It says, would you share your top 5 values from Sherry?
Oh, yep. Be happy to. So passion, okay, growth, balance, integrity, and learning. Okay. And I have all those defined in much more detail on my website. So you're more than welcome to take a look at that. Okay. All right. So thank you for pointing that out. The chat area is a little bit on the side of my screen as I'm kind of navigating this. All right. So equity, right? Defining equity. What exactly is equity? So when we look at equity, this picture, I saw that one of the diversity trainings I've attended did a pretty good job of outlining it, right? Equality is everybody getting the same treatment. So when you look at the boxes, everybody getting the same. Equity, basically, well, the shortest guy with whatever deficiencies, we give them what they need in order so that they can participate, they can grow together. Okay, so fairly straightforward on this part. Now, what is it in equity when it comes to the equities in education? Okay, one of the biggest challenges in education, when we look at the history of education, the education system was created in the 1900s during the early industrial revolution. It was a system built to create employees for the industrial workplace. So people punching, working the assembly line, pushing the machines and so forth. Okay, that's the system as a whole. While many new topic has been introduced, the system as a whole hasn't changed too much. So when we look at equity, equity says individual development is at the top of the list. How do you develop every single child? How do you develop every single student that comes through so that they get whatever scaffolds that's needed for them to be successful, right? That doesn't typically exist. So in education, imagine that you go into an educational arena and the professor, the teacher, whoever it is in front of you says, oh, hi Sarah, hi Sherry, hi so-and-so. We know this is where you're at, this is where you can become, and let's work on some of these things. It's not a blank slate. The challenge in a lot of forms of education, the instructor oftentimes don't know who you are from anybody, and they give you the generic stuff that they've prepared. Okay, so individualistic development is the core of this. Now, how do we do this? Student inventory. Right now, we don't typically do student inventories. Right now, and I speak specifically from my university experience. In the university I've created, we created a student inventory. When they come in, I want to know what your passions are, what your values are, what your deficiencies are in emotional intelligence, in leadership skills, and systems thinking, right? We assess all those pieces so we know exactly where you are so that we can build your talent, right? So at any level, whether it's K through 12 to university, let's capture the interest of the children. Let's get a good understanding of what are the emotional hooks they need. Because in our education system right now, it's, we've all seen the TV show where, Are You Smarter Than the Fifth Grader, right? And most of the sessions when I watch it, I'm like, adults are constantly losing to these fifth graders. Why is that, right? And when we ask people, how much do you remember from your college degree? How much do you remember from the last course you took? And we can ask our kids that, how much do we remember, right? A lot of times the memory is always a challenge. They may pass and get an A in a test, but the remembering and the ability to use that in a timely fashion is lower and lower and lower as time goes on. And that's the biggest challenge in our education. So the student inventory helps to build emotional hooks so that the learning can be solidified in a long-term memory piece. Okay. The practical side, on the teachers, right? Teachers need different types of skills development to get a better understanding of how this system may work. We have a lot of caring teachers in a lot of different districts, but they may not have the tools to do this. Because at the end of the day, if you look at a teacher, they're working with 100, 150 kids in the different periods, right? How do we do this in a scalable way? Which is where technology comes in, which is where performance management comes in and help guided teachers to develop the skills with the technology to manage all of this information, right? Because otherwise it'll be information overload. You can't do 150 students inventory and stick it in some human being's brain and then tell them to teach whatever they teach, right? So there has to be a connection between all of that, okay? And then on the parent side, The parent side needs to get have a good understanding of the knowledge base of what is equity, what does my child need, right? And then some transparency between what are we teaching the kids, right? Have an agreement ahead of time so that everybody's in on it at the same time. And my conversation with some of the school district teachers is, everything's on Schoology, right? But while there's a lot of things that the kids picked up pretty well on Schoology, what's the support system for parents? Most parents may not be as technically savvy as the kids are. As we all know, the kids are really good at taking videos, making movies and such, but the parents may not have the skills. So the transparency, even though there might be a system, the transparency isn't there from a technical perspective, right? So building that teamwork together between the technology, the teachers, the parents is what's really needed to build an equitable system. Okay? All right, so now that kind of leads back over to the inclusion part. What exactly is inclusion? Okay. So definition of inclusion is the active and intentional engagement, that everybody's voice matters. Okay. I've had some interesting personal experiences recently where inclusion is all about talk and not in action, right? But then sometimes this is part of human life where people want to exclude you because they're afraid of you or they don't know you or they fear the unknown. But a lot of times in the behavior side, we depend on individuals to be inclusive. That's a challenging approach, okay? I don't want to wait and see if I get lucky and get a good teacher for my child. I don't want to wait for that. That's a gamble. I want to create a system where everybody is going to be including in the educational process, right? That's where systems comes in. So rather than creating a battleground, like in our current environment, right? We've all been to board meetings and so forth, our school board meetings and such, and there's so little time for people to be included. Decisions are made and so little time to people are included. And then what happens? Everybody starts fighting for that 30 minutes, right? It's a system built on excluding you from the decision process where half the decision's already made, mine's already made up, and then stick 30 minutes there where the community can all come in and fight for that 30 minutes, right? It's a system built for that, like that battleground. Why don't we create a system where everybody's included up front before decisions are made? So enabling what I call knowledge creation, because I believe our community has some incredible, brilliant minds with some ideas that we don't know about. Until we start collecting that information, nothing's going to happen. Okay. So ultimate outcomes and things we want to measure: culture of belonging, feeling valued, right? Feeling respected from others. In this time, it's so fascinating because so many people are fighting back and forth about the masks, about CRT and so forth. And feeling valued only happens within your own little group. Using a methodology like this can easily help bridge the gap. That's why I see the power of having a system that guides us to understand each other much better, rather than misinformation, blanket judgments that doesn't honor any of the DEI components. Okay, that's what DEI really is about, right? In corporations, they're doing it. Most of them are doing a horrible job. I've seen people get paid as much as over $500,000. Okay, one of our very close neighbors here in a major corporation, she gets over $500,000 a year for being a chief diversity officer. When you walk into her office, 7 pictures of herself, and then after 2 years of work at $500,000 a year salary, okay, after 2 years of work, the only quota she can meet is the LGBTQ. No other quotas ever. Everything was about effort. I made a good effort, therefore I deserve this. I made a good effort, therefore I deserve this. Okay. Now, which goes back to accountability, right? If we want to do anything successful, we have to measure to know exactly what's going on. We've created what's called a DEI Snapshot. Okay. Diversity at the individual level. What are your perceptions? How are you thinking? Diversity at the organizational level. How is it being applied? The fascinating thing in our little study is that we found the individual side of diversity, equity, inclusion is always higher than how organizational is applying it. And the worst thing that Sarah mentioned earlier in her interest in inclusion is that when you look at the data, individual belief about inclusion has the biggest gap between organizational inclusion, right? There's a lot of conversations about inclusion in the workplace, but yet when you make simple things like meeting agendas, are you included in meeting agendas unless you're the manager? How is there inclusive process happening within the meetings, right? And then fold that out into the bigger community space where it's much, much harder to get people together to get that inclusion. So that's the biggest gap right now that we see when we look at the DEI space. But you can see every single one of them, the individual basis, beliefs, values, and perceptions is always different, higher than the organizational side. This gives us the opportunity to say, okay, what do we work on first? We go to the biggest gap and say, let's move this forward. We need to make the organization more inclusive from a process and systems perspective, not from an individual perspective, right? Individual training on this doesn't really work at all, okay? So there has to be, whenever you want to give training to somebody, it has to be, do I want to learn it? Does the people have time to learn it? How am I going to apply it? Is there accountability structure? Is there a support structure to apply it? There's so many variables in a learning system to make this happen. So systems is the area to work on from an inclusive perspective. Okay. All right. So on the final side, when we look at the whole system overall, okay, it has to start with the tacit knowledge on the bottom. And then we go from a tacit knowledge all the way to explicit knowledge, right? What do we know in ourselves that's valuable or not? What's the explicit knowledge that's here? The explicit knowledge is the textbooks. It's this little presentation that we're giving you, things on YouTube and so forth. That's explicit knowledge, right? Going into information transfer, how do we transfer it in such a way that we can retain it in the best possible way? And then application of that, and then quantifying the impact. If I'm able to apply it, that's how I remember it, but that's how I make a difference, okay? This full cycle is part of what an inclusive system looks like from a learning perspective, okay? In most situations, in most companies, it's only these two, right? I have a lot of textbooks, I have a course on diversity, I have an inclusive leadership course, I push that information to you on a weekly level, and boom, it's done, okay? But are we applying it? Are we remembering to apply it? And is there metrics to hold us accountable and give us feedback on how successful that is? That's the full system that needs to be put in place. So when we do this, outcomes, higher confidence, right? We remember much more. We actually develop these life skills we need for our children that needs when they go into school and so forth, or college or whatever life pursuits they have. They actually have the life skills to be successful, right? Emotional intelligence, right? Huge aspect of all of this. And anybody taken an emotional intelligence class, by the way? Or some type of workshop? Sarah did. What was that like?
Thought it was interesting.
Yeah. So what was the duration and what's the accountability to action?
It was a few hours, and then it was creating coursework for other people and utilizing it in that creation process.
Okay, nice. So now one thing I like to ask people that's taken some type of emotional intelligence training, did they evoke some strong emotion in you to teach you how to manage a strong emotion?
I think it was more making me aware of when emotions were affecting me and asking the question why that was happening. I would probably say the managing part would have been the step after that, but it maybe didn't quite meet that.
Yeah. So like in my perfect little world in designing emotional intelligence development happens over a long period. It doesn't happen over a couple of weeks, couple of months, sometimes even a year, right? So if we're designing emotional intelligence education, it's how we engage, not the content so much, right? Most universities tend to get trapped into, here's a bunch of content. Here's all the wonderful theories about EQ and how it's improved leadership outcomes, how it's made people successful. Here's the data. But emotional intelligence education is how we teach, how I show respect in the process of it. I can't teach emotional intelligence if I'm not practicing it on a regular basis, if I'm not recognizing that you're not engaged in this conversation, right? If the kids are sitting there playing on their phones and doing whatever, and the teacher or professor simply continues on with their stuff, what's the outcome, right? Very low memory retention in the first place. And emotional intelligence, it's just another knowledge piece. So EQ is not necessarily about what you teach, it's about how we teach. Okay, and we're going to have another conversation later on the schedule here. If you've all seen the schedule, we're going to talk a lot more about emotional intelligence and how to educate people from an emotional intelligence perspective. Okay. All right. So any questions on any of these outcomes and the inclusive system in learning? No? Okay, great. All right. So in order for you to make the most of it, of this seminar, I hopefully part of your recall, right? 10% or less if you simply listen and watch. Ideally, move it to 75% or higher by applying what you learn. Okay, so something that we've developed after every single workshop that I do is this particular sheet, right? What did you learn? What are the actions you're going to take in a specific timeline? Okay, any resources you need, and accountability structure. Who's going to hold me accountable to applying something new and being courageous enough to get out into the unknown and be different and do something that I'm not comfortable with, right? That's how we learn. That's how we're going to remember it. So hopefully you've got a lot of good information out of this and see DEI in a little bit of different space. And if we want to have a further conversation, more than happy to do that about how we apply DEI in the various parts of the world that you live in, whether it's your children or whether it's your workplace. It's happening a lot of places, and it's really sad to see the professional world sometimes tend to kind of dumb it down to a single course and then, oh, here you go, here's a certificate, and not weave this into the organizational fabric of how the company operates, how decisions are made. There's so many bits and pieces, and our school districts is one that is a victim of this to some extent because they're working in a very much of a hierarchical management system. Decisions are made at the top, the school board and the superintendent, and the lack of inclusiveness is what gets the community fighting. And so there's so many different systemic changes that needs to be made so that how decisions get made, what information is available is much more transparent, and that has to come from the systems perspective. Okay. All right, so any questions?
So I love all of this, but I struggle to see how it can be applied to such a wide level as a school system, because even with, like you talked about the values, talking about that with even one other person can get you really deep. So then to talk about it with, thousands of people, and as you said, when you talked about inclusion, forcing people to do it isn't helpful. How do you then apply it to that many people who all have their personal individual starts that are important, and not all of whom will be interested in engaging?
So let's talk about the process of engagement on that. Okay. So I've shared with you here what you see is a international value study on values. Okay. This is something I've done starting in 2006, and then I've even published a book on it. Basically, this survey enables you to collect values at a broader scope. So it's not an individual conversation. This is scalable for a company of 10,000, for a city of 1 million, whatever that is. And there are analytics in the background that allows me to narrow this down from a numerical perspective, right? So if I have 10 people that says respect is number one, and 5 people overhead here that says, integrity is number one, how do we numerically calculate that out so that a community can come up with a shared value statement? Okay. So part of the research here, one of my other books that I wrote, it looked at values differences between Chinese business leaders and American business leaders, right? So we sampled close to probably a little over 1,000 on both sides. And then we've come together with a shared set of values on both sides. And then we said, okay, here's how the values align or don't align. And here's the challenges in doing business, okay? And then I kind of rolled that out into a global study with a large number of universities in 4 different continents. And then we looked at students. What are the core values? How do they differ? How do we inspire the students based on those value sets, right? So there are systems and technology pieces to make this happen. Now, from a school district perspective, this resource can easily be used for that purpose. I've already had conversations with John about this. And this is one of the things that he's going to take on as one of the, after he sees his initiative to create a strategic plan for the city of Dublin. And part of the strategic plan will also include who are we, what are our core values. So hopefully we will engage in that in the very near future. I'm kind of urging him, hey, maybe we do this a little bit earlier so we can find a common basis and use the value set to show the community how we're similar. Right now, the community is so divided on so many different topical things, but there's no common ground. We're looking for differences versus we're looking for the common basis of what we're connected to, right? And in our community, it shouldn't be that hard for us to say, oh, wow, maybe respect is up here pretty high from our values perspective, right? We've shared it. We share this respect value, or whatever value we can share, right? Finding the sharing the common ground to it. Now, the second question that you asked is very interesting because it deals with how do we get people to engage? All right. Not everybody's going to want to engage. And this is where inclusivity happens. We can easily say, hey, we're looking to do this. Would you participate? And create environments, and even put games in there, right? I mean, we've seen companies use surveys or prizes. Hey, surprise, somebody can win a $500 gift certificate to Amazon, right? And people participate. And this is like, we're not asking people for an hour, 15 minutes. We're asking people for 5 minutes, 10 minutes to do that survey, right? All you got to do is write down eight top values. That's it. So we're not asking for so much, and we can easily create a game as a district, as a community, say, go engage, go have some fun. And the ultimate outcome at the individual level is your family communications will be better at the end of this. This is not for a political measure. This is not for anything else, but your relationship with your friends. So you can minimize future conflicts by having a deeper understanding of core values of who people are. That's the beauty of that. I'm hoping that will be a good, strong argument to spend 5 minutes to do that. Great. Okay, any other questions? Go ahead, Sherry.
So you talked about with inclusion, I think one of the big issues we have in Dublin is people don't feel like they're being heard. And like you said, you have a 30-minute block of time, 3 minutes per person, pretty much, unless you send an email board or Mr. Matt Charleston, there's no other way to really communicate before decisions are made.
Mm-hmm.
So do you have an idea of how to change that so that more parents can be heard and it's not, 500 people sending an email about
right.
something and nobody knows what everyone else is thinking because it's
exactly.
To
Yep. Yeah, definitely. So within the next couple of weeks, you'll see me. I'm going to launch Voices of Dublin. Okay. It's going to be a knowledge collection system. So let me kind of backstep a little bit. So I've done this in organizations where we go to a company and say, what if we collected the ideas of every single person from the janitor to the CEO to build your innovations, right? We took that knowledge basic system from a human systems process, from a skills basis to drive number of ideas per employee, okay? It's a technology, it's a concept, there's training around it, there's process and systems that builds around it to drive people to share ideas. So you measure ideas per employee. Now, at the community level, what if we had a metric for the city that looked at ideas per community member, right? Get everybody to engage and share ideas. And now at the central repository of that, we are completely transparent. We're going to, so this is a partial anonymous system, okay? And let me tell you why this shouldn't be a complete anonymous system, because if I have a great idea and I put half the ideas in, but I'm missing a few parts, there's no way for the system to come back to me and say, oh, what about this? What about that? I may be able to build on that idea, right? And plus, if you have a great idea, you should be recognized for it. It should be celebrated, okay? So I want it to be a partial anonymous system. And the partial other aspects of it is, I want to strip away age, gender, race, education, all of that stuff, right? So when we see the idea based on the value of the idea itself. It has to be a solution-oriented idea, okay? So the Voices of Dublin will be that project that I'm going to be launching in a couple of weeks here. And that'll hopefully be a central repository of ideas that the community can come together and share. And then we'll put those ideas together, synthesize specific outcome to say, okay, the community has said this, we'll categorize into different topics, right? One could be about CRT, one could be about DEI or whatever that is. Whatever hot topics are, we put that together. And then we create action plans based on that. This is ideas from our community. Here's some action plans. And then being transparent, this becomes accountability structure for our elected officials. Okay, other questions? Oh, looks like Hannah asked a question in text. So she says, I think it's a good idea that you pointed out that sharing top values is important. It's not easy for some people to identify their own values. Do I have a methodology to do that? So with values, it takes a lot of reflection, and it's hard for people. Sometimes their immediate situation tends to deflect the type of values that they actually hold near and dear to their heart. So this is a ongoing conversation with yourself. So in the best situation, you wake up in the morning, the best time to reflect on yourself and your own identity of who you want to be is in the morning time. Your brain is relatively free from the day's hassles and stresses of schedules and so forth, everything you have to do. And you can really sit down and say, okay, who am I? Ask yourself, who am I? Do that in the morning. See if you can get a couple of values down. The next morning, do the same thing. The next morning, do the same thing, right? And then you'll get a good understanding. Okay, in different mornings, I'm having this, but you'll see a consistent theme that comes out of you, right? Asking those questions are really going to be key to identifying who your values are. Now, that's the organic version, okay? People that really want to be the mechanical side, the analytical mind, the engineers and so forth, they want a list to choose from, right? When we looked at that specific study earlier, and I can put that link in this document, you're more than welcome to go explore it. So that particular link, that's the website for the values. Now that's the full study. So it is probably 10, 20 minutes complete. But what we really need is to, look at the list of values, select topic, right? Prioritize it. In the assessment tool, you can easily move it up and down to get a good understanding. So that's the analytical side. You can do it the fast track, but still come back to yourself in the evening, in the mornings, reflect, who am I? Ask yourself that, okay? When you ask yourself that, ask it at least 3 times, because typically your brain will engage on who am I? That's the psychological side. A lot of reasons will come out. And then when you ask more, your brain says, well, wait a second, maybe that's not fully true. Who am I? Then you get to an emotional state, and then eventually you get to a spiritual answer that calls to who am I as a human being, right? That's the core to get a hold on to. Once you understand who you are as a human being, as the core of your spirituality, then you can be incredibly powerful. There's a lot of different studies done on very powerful, successful global leaders, whether bad or good, they got aligned with their core values and their spiritual self. That's the power that's underneath that once you get there. Okay. All right. See, Hannah asked another question. She says, another question is about the picture of equality versus equity. It's a popular picture. Most have seen it before. Some people ask what the tall guy is. If the tall guy refused to stand up, but keep laying down on the stand, what's your answer? Let me see if I understand the question correctly. Some people ask if the tall guy refused to stand up in the picture and keeps laying down. Okay, so if I'm understanding the question here, the scenario is that not everybody wants to stand and watch the baseball game, right? So not everybody wants to grow and learn, and that's kind of like the assumption here. So if I'm answering, I'm addressing that question correctly, Hannah, feel free to add some text down there. And this kind of goes back to who we are as human beings, a creature, okay? All of us are curious, especially when we're little, right? We go stick our heads where we're not supposed to, sticks our finger where we're not supposed to, but the older we get constrained with rules and conditions, and that says, don't do this, don't do this, don't do this. Society starts placing a lot of rules on us, okay? At some point, that person that chooses to lay down says, those rules hurt me. I don't want to explore anymore. I'm hurt. All I can do is fight. Okay. That's when we need to start looking at that person and say, how do we get that person to be curious again? How do we put that little piece of candy, bring the child out and put that little piece of candy there and say, hey, look at this shiny little thing. Everybody's going for it. Let's have some fun. Let's have a race and get there, right? Create a fun little scenario for that particular environment. And this has to be environmental intervention here. Okay, it's not a one-on-one conversation that says, oh, I'm a great teacher and I'll have a conversation with your child and therefore your child will decide to learn if they're choosing to lay down. It's an environment that moves a child forward, that moves any human being forward. So creating that environment to inspire the child to say, oh, learning can be fun, right? The interesting part is whenever I teach executives, I always ask them, hey, do you expect this to be fun? What if we made it fun, right? People don't expect learning to be fun as older adults because you're used to information thrown at you constantly, right? We've been conditioned to think learning is work. assignments, tests, no fun? What if learning was fun? What if we kept it fun? We injected that fun element back into it. That person choosing to lay down will automatically get up because they see everybody else having fun. Okay, so Hannah, hopefully I understood your question in the text. If I didn't, feel free to ask on. All right, any other questions? I'm loving this conversation. This is great. Oh, Hannah says, okay, thank you. Great. Okay. Well, if there are no other questions, if you want access to the snapshot, I can easily send you that if you want. Do you guys want the snapshot? If I can grab it real quick somewhere on my computer. Yeah, or just send me an email and I'll be happy to send you the snapshot. You can kind of take it and I can give you some results on how you see your company and your relationship to your beliefs and your values basis on what the company's doing from your organizational perspective, right? Or you can do it, or even make it more fun. We can easily do it with a family dynamic, with a family structure, right? Have mom, dad, brother, sister, take this little thing and see how the family sees themselves, right? An organization is also your family. It's your most intimate organization. So if we can improve that, we can improve the overall whole. All right, so thank you very much for your time. I appreciate the time that you've taken to come have this conversation with me. Have a wonderful day, and I will see you soon. And hopefully we'll see you in other workshops on the CRT and the other aspects of it. And by the way, one quick note, CRT is being used as a fairly tricky weapon in many different spaces. And if we look at the actual academic perspective of CRT, it's not a weapon. It is not a weapon to be used to fight. It can actually be used to help us build a better community, understanding each other much, much better. And that's my objective with that particular one. So this is a foundation piece, and hopefully you can attend and get other people to attend the CRT one later on as well. Okay.
Can I ask a quick question before you go?
No, feel free.
So can we get access to the recording of this since you have it,
Sure.
so that we can share the foundation with others? Okay.
Yep, be happy to. I think if you are registered through the eBright, I have your emails. So eBright have the emails. I will send a link out through that system. If you came in a different way, just let me know. Dr. Ted Sun is my email. Let me put that down.
Mm-hmm.
You can just drop me an email if you don't get it within the next 30 minutes. I'll have to wait for the system to process. And then so I'll send it out to you by the end of the day, and then you'll have it. And if you have other people that wasn't able to attend, there's a 7 o'clock one. Questions will be probably different, and we can go from there. Okay. All right. Thank you very much for your time.
Yeah.
Have a great day.
Nice day.
Yeah.
Bye.
Bye-bye.